They said Duke Lucien Draven owned everything worth owning in the kingdom: land, loyalty, fear. They said no woman had ever looked him in the eye and walked away whole. But on the night Lady Seraphine Vale crossed his marble threshold, wearing black velvet and a silence that cut deeper than any blade, every man in that banquet hall learned the same lesson at the same moment. The most dangerous creature in any room is the one who has already decided she has nothing left to lose. Stay until the very end of this story. What she does next will change every assumption you have ever held about power, survival, and the cost of being underestimated. The candles in the grand hall of Ashworth Palace numbered over 3,000. Seraphine had counted them once, years ago, back when she still believed that beauty meant safety and that grandeur meant someone, somewhere, was keeping watch. She did not count them tonight. Tonight she watched the way their light moved across the faces of people who had already decided she was finished. The invitation had arrived 4 days earlier. Heavy cream paper. The royal crest pressed deep into crimson wax. Her name written in a clerk's careful hand, not Lucien's. That detail told her everything. He wanted her present, but had not bothered to summon her personally. She was expected to arrive like furniture, positioned, decorative, silent. Her maid, Bettina, had laid out 3 gowns on the bed that morning. Ivory silk, pale rose chiffon, a sage green that her mother had once called dignified. Seraphine walked past all 3 and opened the chest beneath her window where she kept the dress she had never worn. Black velvet, floor length, cut close to the body with no adornment, no jewels, no lace. It was a dress designed for a woman attending her own funeral or someone else's. "My lady," Bettina said, her voice thin. "That color, at a royal banquet. People will talk." "People are already talking," Seraphine said. "Tonight I am going to give them something worth saying." The carriage ride took 40 minutes through streets still damp from an afternoon rain. Seraphine sat with her hands folded in her lap, her spine never once touching the seat back. She watched the city pass through the rain-streaked glass and felt nothing she could name. Not rage, not grief. Something older than both. Something that lived in the marrow, in the space between breathing in and breathing out, where the body stores everything the mind refuses to carry. She had heard the rumors 11 days ago. A merchant's wife had whispered it to her seamstress, who whispered it to Bettina, who had stood trembling in the doorway of Seraphine's study, holding a cup of tea she had already let go cold. "There is a woman," Bettina had said, "a young woman. She has been seen at the Duke's private residence 3 times this week. The servants say she stays past midnight." Seraphine had not looked up from her correspondence. "Does she have a name?" "Viola Marchand. She is the daughter of a minor baron from the eastern provinces, 20 years old. They say she is very beautiful." "They always are." That was all she had said. She finished her letter, sealed it, and went to bed. But she did not sleep. She lay in the dark and felt something shift inside her chest. Not a breaking, but a hardening. Like clay pushed into a kiln. Something soft becoming something that could cut. Now the carriage stopped at the palace gates, and a footman opened her door. She stepped out into the cool night air, and the torchlight caught the black velvet and made it shine like wet stone. 2 guards flanked the entrance. She saw their eyes move across her dress and then away, quickly, as though they had accidentally looked at something they were not meant to see. The corridor leading to the grand hall was lined with portraits of former dukes, their painted eyes following every visitor with the same expression of inherited certainty. Seraphine had walked this corridor 100 times. She knew each face. She knew which ones had been kind and which ones had built their legacies on the silence of women who had been trained never to scream. She could hear the banquet before she saw it. Laughter. The clink of crystal. A string quartet playing something composed specifically for the evening, sweet and meaningless. The massive oak doors stood open, and golden light poured out like something spilling. Seraphine paused at the threshold. She did not adjust her dress. She did not touch her hair. She simply breathed, one long, measured breath, and walked in. The hall was magnificent. That word had always annoyed her, but tonight she could not deny it. The ceiling soared 60 feet above the floor, painted with scenes of conquest that nobody ever looked at closely enough to notice the bodies. Long tables draped in white linen stretched the length of the room, laden with silver and crystal and flowers, arranged to look effortless. Over 400 guests filled the space, nobles, diplomats, military commanders, their wives and daughters dressed in silk and satin and pearls. that caught the candlelight and scattered it like small conspiracies of brightness. And then they saw her. The silence did not arrive all at once. It moved through the room like a wave, starting near the doors where Seraphine stood and rolling outward, table by table, conversation by conversation, until even the string quartet faltered and went still. 400 faces turned toward the woman in black velvet, and in their eyes, Seraphine saw the only honest thing these people had ever shown her, fear dressed as fascination. She walked forward. Her heels struck the marble floor with the kind of precision that comes not from practice, but from absolute refusal to hesitate. She did not look left or right. She did not acknowledge the whispers that had already begun moving through the crowd like smoke through a cracked window. She saw him. Duke Lucien Draven stood near the head of the great table, a glass of wine in his left hand, his body angled slightly toward the woman beside him. He was tall. He had always been tall, with the kind of lean, angular frame that made expensive clothing look like it had been designed specifically for his shoulders. His dark hair was swept back, and his jaw was set in the expression Seraphine knew best, controlled, calculating, absolutely certain of the ground beneath his feet. The woman beside him was young, Viola Marchand. Seraphine had never seen her before, but she recognized her instantly, not from any physical description, but from the way she stood, close to Lucien's arm, tilted slightly toward him, smiling with the particular brightness of someone who believes they have won something without yet understanding the cost. Viola wore white. Of course she did. Ivory silk with seed pearls stitched along the bodice, her blonde hair pinned with fresh flowers. She looked exactly like what she was, a prop, a declaration. A message from Lucien to every person in this room that Lady Seraphine Vale had already been replaced, and the replacement was young and smiling and grateful. My God, someone whispered behind Seraphine. She actually came. Seraphine walked to the table. She stopped 8 feet from Lucien, close enough for him to see the texture of the black velvet, the clean lines of her collarbone, the total absence of jewelry at her throat. She had removed every piece he had ever given her, even the sapphire ring from their engagement, the one he had slid onto her finger while telling her that their family's alliance would make them both untouchable, sat now at the bottom of the river Ashford, where she had thrown it that morning from the bridge. Lady Vale. Lucien's voice was even, controlled, pitched for an audience. What an unexpected pleasure. Nothing about tonight should be unexpected, Your Grace, Seraphine said. You sent the invitation yourself. I did. His eyes moved across her dress. She saw him register the black, the absence of ornament, the meaning. Though I confess I did not anticipate your choice of attire. One might think you were in mourning. One might think a great many things. Seraphine turned her gaze slowly, deliberately, toward Viola Marchand. The younger woman stiffened under the look, but held her ground, chin lifted, smile fixed in place with the kind of rigid determination that passes for courage in people who have never actually been tested. And who might this be? The pause before Lucien answered lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Seraphine counted them. Miss Viola Marchand, a guest of the household. A guest. Seraphine let the words sit between them like a stone dropped into still water. How generous of you, Your Grace. You have always been so generous with your hospitality. The nearest tables had gone completely silent. Seraphine could feel the attention of the room pressing against her back, like heat from an open furnace. She stood inside it and felt nothing burn. Viola spoke first. It was a mistake, and Seraphine recognized it the instant the younger woman opened her mouth, not because of what she said, but because of the particular quality of confidence in her voice. The confidence of someone who has been told they are protected and has not yet learned that protection is always conditional. Lady Vale, Viola said, and her voice carried further than she probably intended. How lovely of you to join us. I have heard so much about you. The Duke speaks of your family's legacy with such fondness. The word landed exactly as it was designed to land, a small, perfectly placed insult wrapped in the thinnest possible layer of courtesy. Fondness. The way one speaks of a childhood pet or a house one has outgrown. Seraphine heard it. Everyone heard it. And in the silence that followed, she felt the last restraint inside her chest snap like a bowstring cut by a blade. Does he? Seraphine said, not a question. He does. Viola's smile widened. She reached out and touched Lucien's arm, a gesture so small and so pointed that it could not have been anything other than deliberate. He tells me the Vale family once had such influence. Such standing. It must be difficult, watching those things slip away. The room was holding its breath. Seraphine could feel 400 people leaning forward in their seats, waiting for her to cry or flee or lower her head and accept the cut with the quiet dignity that women in her position were expected to perform. She had performed that dignity for years. She had worn it like a second skin, so tight she sometimes forgot where it ended and her actual self began. Not tonight. Seraphine moved. Later, witnesses would disagree on the exact sequence, how quickly she crossed those 8 feet of marble, whether she said anything before her hand closed around Viola Marchand's hair, whether the younger woman screamed immediately, or whether there was a moment of stunned silence before the sound tore itself free from her throat. But every account agreed on one detail. When Seraphine's fingers twisted into that carefully pinned blonde hair and pulled, she did not hesitate. There was no trembling, no wild emotion in her eyes. She moved with the cold, mechanical precision of someone performing a task she had already rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times. Viola shrieked. The sound split the air of the grand hall like glass breaking against stone. Her hands flew to her scalp, clawing at Seraphine's grip, but Seraphine held her with a strength that seemed impossible for a woman of her frame. The strength that comes from somewhere beyond muscle, from the place where years of compressed silence and swallowed fury have been building pressure against the walls of the body like water behind a dam. Seraphine dragged her. Across the marble floor, past the first table, where Lord Ashworth sat frozen with a forkful of roasted pheasant, halfway to his mouth. Past the second table, where 3 baronesses clutched each other's arms with expressions that hovered between horror and something that looked terrifyingly close to satisfaction. Past the third table, the fourth, the fifth. Viola's silk dress gathering dust and wine stains as her body was hauled across the polished stone, her screams echoing off the painted ceiling where those ancient scenes of conquest suddenly seemed less decorative and more like a warning. No one moved. That was the part that would haunt the palace for months afterward. Not the act itself. Scandals involving women were common enough in aristocratic circles, collected and traded like currency, but the absolute paralyzing stillness of every other person in that room. Guards stood at attention along the walls, their hands on their sword hilts, their eyes tracking the scene with the bewildered focus of men receiving contradictory orders from their training and their instincts. Servants froze mid-step, carrying trays of champagne that trembled but did not spill. Nobles sat in their gilded chairs and watched a woman dragged screaming across their banquet hall, and not one of them stood up. And Lucien, Duke Lucien Draven, the most powerful man in the kingdom, the man whose word could mobilize armies and whose displeasure could erase a family's legacy in a single evening, stood exactly where he had been standing when Seraphine's hand closed around Viola's hair. His wine glass was still in his left hand. His expression had not changed, or rather, it had changed, but the change was subtle. A slight parting of the lips, a narrowing of the eyes, a stillness in his body that was different from the stillness of fear. He looked like a man watching something he had not predicted. And for Lucien Draven, the unpredictable was more disturbing than the violent. Seraphine released Viola at the center of the hall. The younger woman collapsed on the marble, her hair wild, her white dress ruined, her mascara streaked down cheeks that had gone the color of raw dough. She was sobbing, great, shuddering gasps that seemed too large for her small body, the sobs of someone who has just discovered that the world does not follow the rules she was promised. Seraphine stood over her. Her breathing was even. Her black velvet was untouched. She looked down at the crumpled figure at her feet with an expression that contained no satisfaction, no triumph, no cruelty. Only the flat, exhausted clarity of a woman who has just stopped pretending. She turned and faced the room. "My name," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of that vast hall without rising above a conversational tone, "is Lady Seraphine Vale. My family has served this kingdom for 9 generations. We have bled for its borders, built its bridges, and buried our dead in its soil. I will not stand in any hall, not this one, not any other, and be mocked by a child who was invited to my engagement banquet as my replacement." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. It pressed down on the room like a physical force, compressing every breath, every heartbeat, every half-formed thought into a single, unbearable density of attention. Seraphine looked at Lucien. He looked back at her. And in that exchange, that wordless collision of 2 gazes across 20 feet of candlelit marble, something shifted in the architecture of their relationship. She saw it move behind his eyes like a shadow passing across a wall. Not anger, not even surprise anymore. Something more dangerous than either. Curiosity. The focused, predatory curiosity of a man who has just discovered that the woman he thought he understood is someone he has never actually met. Seraphine turned and walked toward the doors. Her heels struck the marble with the same precise rhythm as her entrance, unhurried, unbroken, absolutely steady. She did not look back. She did not need to. She could feel every eye in the room following her, and she carried their attention like a garment, like armor, like the black velvet that moved against her body with each step. She passed through the oak doors and into the corridor of painted dukes. Their eyes followed her, as they always did. But tonight, for the first time, she did not feel judged by them. She felt observed. She felt acknowledged. As though those painted men, those conquerors and manipulators and builders of empire, recognized in her walk something they understood better than anyone. The carriage was waiting. Bettina sat inside, her face white, her hands knotted in her lap. She had heard the screams from the courtyard. "My lady." "Home," Seraphine said. She climbed in. She sat down. She placed her hands in her lap and felt them tremble for the first time that evening, not with fear, but with the aftershock of a detonation she had been carrying inside her body for longer than she could remember. The carriage moved. The palace lights fell away behind them, growing smaller in the rain-speckled glass until they looked like distant stars collapsing. Seraphine closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She sat in the dark and listened to the horses and the wheels and the rain, and she thought about what she had done and what would happen next. The scandal would spread by morning. Every noble house within 100 miles would know her name and what she had done with it. Some would call her mad. Some would call her brave. Most would simply call her ruined. Let them. She had spent 26 years learning to be exactly what the world demanded: graceful, composed, strategic, silent. She had swallowed insults like medicine and smiled while the bitterness worked its way through her system. She had watched her family's power diminish year by year, contract by contract, as Lucian Draven systematically isolated the Vale name from its allies, its income, and its legacy, all while holding her engagement as a leash he could tighten or loosen at his pleasure. Tonight she had cut the leash. She did not yet know what that would cost her. She knew only that the price of keeping it had become higher than she could pay. The carriage arrived at Vale House just before midnight. The estate was dark except for the light in her father's study. Lord Edmund Vale, who slept less and less these days, who sat up most nights with brandy and old maps, tracing borders that no longer belonged to him with fingers that shook from something worse than age. Seraphine entered through the side door. She moved through the hall quietly, but not quietly enough. "Seraphine." His voice came from the open study door. She stopped. She could see the edge of his desk, the amber glow of the lamp, the shadow of his hand resting on the arm of his chair. She stood in the corridor and calculated whether she could survive the conversation she was about to have. She walked in. Lord Edmund Vale looked older than 63. His hair had gone entirely white in the 2 years since Marcus died. Marcus, Seraphine's older brother, who had drowned in a river crossing that everyone called an accident, and no one investigated beyond the surface. Edmund's face had the hollowed quality of a man who has been emptied by grief but continues to sit upright out of habit, the way a building remains standing after a fire has consumed everything inside its walls. "You went," he said. "I went." "And?" Seraphine sat down across from him. She looked at the brandy on his desk, at the map spread beneath his hands, at the portrait of Marcus that hung behind him, her brother's painted face, young and confident and permanently 24. She looked at all of it and felt the trembling in her hands move up through her arms and into her chest, where it became something less like trembling and more like a kind of engine, running hard and fast in the dark. "I dragged Lucien's mistress across the banquet hall floor by her hair," she said, "in front of 400 people, in front of the Duke himself." Edmund did not move. His expression did not change. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the soft creak of the house settling around them. "Good," he said. Seraphine stared at him. She had expected anger, panic, a lecture about propriety and survival, and the careful game their family had been playing for years, always yielding, always calculating, always accepting the smaller portion in exchange for the promise of eventual security that never arrived. "Good?" she said. Edmund reached for his brandy. His hand trembled, but his grip was firm. "Your mother would have done the same thing. She would have done it sooner." Mother would have been more strategic about it. Your mother was strategic every day of her life. It killed her. He drank, set the glass down, looked at his daughter with eyes that held something she had not seen in them for years. Not hope, exactly, but its first cousin, recognition. What did Lucian do? Nothing. He stood there. He stood there, like a man watching a building fall, calculating whether it was his building or someone else's. Edmund nodded slowly. He will come for you now. You know that. Yes. He will try to destroy what is left of this family. The debts, the contracts, the land agreements, everything he has been holding over our heads, he will call it all due. Yes. And you are prepared for that? Seraphine looked at Marcus's portrait. Her brother's painted eyes looked back at her with an expression the artist had captured perfectly. Warm, intelligent, slightly amused, the face of a man who believed the world was fundamentally reasonable and that reasonable men would always prevail. He had believed that until the river took him, or until whatever had driven him to that river in the first place. I have been preparing for it for 2 years, Seraphine said, since the day Marcus died. Edmund's hand tightened on his glass. What do you mean? I mean, I have not been idle, father. I have not spent these years embroidering handkerchiefs and waiting for Lucian to decide my fate. I have been collecting things, documents, letters, accounts that do not balance, names that appear where they should not appear. The clock ticked. The house creaked. Edmund Vale looked at his daughter across the desk that had once been his father's and his grandfather's before that, and he saw something in her face that made him set his glass down very carefully, as though his hands had suddenly become unreliable. Seraphine, what have you found? She met his eyes. Enough. Enough for what? Enough to burn his empire to the ground. The silence between them was different from the silence in the banquet hall. That silence had been the absence of speech. This silence was the presence of something, a shared understanding moving between father and daughter like a current, reshaping the terrain of their relationship in real time. Edmund was looking at Seraphine the way he had once looked at Marcus, as an equal, as someone capable of carrying weight he could no longer carry alone. Tell me, he said. Not tonight. Seraphine stood. The trembling had stopped. In its place was a steadiness that felt less like calm and more like the stillness of something aimed. Tomorrow, when we are both clear-headed and the house is quiet and I can show you everything in the order it needs to be understood. Is it dangerous? Everything worth doing is dangerous. She walked to the door, then paused. She did not turn around. She spoke to the corridor ahead of her, to the darkness waiting beyond the lamplight, to the version of herself she was still becoming. Father. Yes? Marcus did not drown by accident. The sound Edmund made was not a word. It was not a cry. It was something pulled from the deepest part of a man's chest. The sound of a truth he had been carrying for 2 years without ever speaking it aloud, confirmed now by his daughter's voice in a dark corridor, and the weight of it, the validation and the horror and the nauseating relief of finally hearing someone else say it, bent him forward in his chair like a blow to the stomach. Seraphine walked on, down the corridor, up the stairs, into her room, where the 3 rejected dresses still lay across the bed like shed skins. She locked the door. She sat at her writing desk. She opened the hidden compartment beneath the false bottom of the center drawer and removed a leather portfolio, thin and worn, its surface marked with the impressions of documents pressed flat over months of careful accumulation. Inside were letters, contracts, bank records from accounts that officially did not exist, a map of river crossings with one marked in red ink, and a single page of testimony, written in a hand she did not recognize, signed with a name she did. She spread them across the desk and looked at them the way a general looks at a battlefield before dawn, with cold assessment, with mathematical precision, with the particular kind of focus that belongs to someone who has stopped hoping for the best and started planning for the worst. Tomorrow Lucian would learn what she had done at his banquet if he did not know already. He would calculate, he would strategize, he would deploy every tool in his considerable arsenal: money, influence, intimidation, the deep institutional machinery of a dukedom that had been accumulating power for generations. He would come for her family with everything he had, because that was what men like Lucian did when they felt the first tremor of something they could not control. They did not negotiate. They did not retreat. They crushed. But he did not know about the documents. He did not know about the letters or the bank records or the testimony. He did not know that for 2 years, while he believed Seraphine Vale was sitting quietly in her family's diminishing estate, embroidering and waiting and slowly accepting the shrinking perimeter of her life, she had been building something in the dark, piece by piece, name by name, connection by connection, a weapon made entirely of truth. And truth, she had learned, was the one thing men like Lucian Draven could not buy, could not threaten, and could not make disappear. She closed the portfolio. She placed it back in the hidden drawer. She undressed, hung the black velvet in the wardrobe, and lay down in her bed. The house was quiet. The rain had stopped. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the river. The same river that had taken Marcus, moving through the dark with the indifferent persistence of water finding its way downhill. She listened to it and thought about what rivers carry: silt, debris, secrets, the dissolved remnants of things that were never meant to surface. She thought about Lucian standing frozen in his banquet hall, watching her drag his mistress across the marble floor. She thought about the expression on his face, that predatory curiosity, that recalibration. She thought about what it meant that he had not been angry. Anger she could predict. Anger followed patterns. But curiosity, the curiosity of a man like Lucien, was something else entirely. It meant he was interested. It meant he was paying attention. It meant the game had changed shape, and he wanted to understand the new geometry before he made his next move. Good. Let him study her. Let him send his spies and his accountants and his lawyers to pick through what was left of the Vale estate, looking for leverage, looking for weakness, looking for the familiar pressure points he had been pressing for years. Let him search. He would find exactly what she wanted him to find: an old family name clinging to the edge of relevance, a father drowning in brandy and grief, a daughter who had just humiliated herself at a royal banquet, and who was now, by every reasonable calculation, completely and irrevocably finished. He would not find the documents. He would not find the letters. He would not find the web of contacts she had been building in silence, the minor clerks and disgruntled servants and overlooked bureaucrats who had, one by one, slipped her the pieces of a puzzle that Lucien believed existed only inside his own head. He would not find what she knew about Marcus. Not yet. Seraphine stared at the ceiling. The darkness above her was absolute, featureless, the kind of dark that swallows expression and intention and leaves only the raw fact of a body breathing in a room, alive, alert, waiting. She was not afraid. She had been afraid for 2 years, and the fear had done its work. It had compressed her, sharpened her, burned away everything that was not essential until what remained was something harder and colder and more precise than anything she had been before. Fear was useful. Fear was fuel. But she had moved past it now into the territory beyond, where the only thing that mattered was the next step, and the step after that, and the knowledge that every step brought her closer to the moment when Lucian Draven would understand finally and completely that the woman he had dismissed as decoration had been the most dangerous person in his kingdom all along. Tomorrow the war would begin. But tonight she lay in the dark and listened to the river and let herself feel, for just one moment, the savage, electric satisfaction of knowing that somewhere across this city, in a palace full of candles and silence and 400 people who would not sleep well tonight, Duke Lucian Draven was standing alone in his grand hall, looking at the place on the marble floor where a woman he thought he owned had just shown him exactly what she was. And for the first time in his life, he did not know what to do next. At dawn, a messenger arrived at the gates of Vale House. He carried a single envelope sealed with black wax. Not the Duke's official crimson, but black, which in the language of aristocratic correspondence carried only one meaning: personal, intimate, unmediated by clerks or advisors. Bettina brought it to Seraphine's door. "From the palace, my lady." Seraphine opened it. The letter contained 6 words, written in Lucian's own hand, the script tight and controlled and slanting slightly to the right, in a way she had always found unsettling, as though even his handwriting was trying to press forward, to advance, to close distance. 6 words. "We need to discuss your future." Seraphine read them twice. She folded the letter. She placed it on her desk next to the hidden drawer where 2 years of stolen truth waited in the dark like a loaded weapon. Then she sat down, took out a clean sheet of paper, and wrote her reply. "No. We need to discuss yours." She sealed it with the Vale crest, the old one, the one her family had used before Lucian's influence had forced them to adopt a softer, more subordinate variation. The original crest, the one with teeth. She handed it to Bettina. See that this reaches him before breakfast. Bettina took the letter with trembling hands and disappeared down the corridor. Seraphine stood at her window and watched the sun rise over the river. The same river, always the same river, and felt the first morning of her war break open across the sky like something that had been waiting a very long time to arrive. The messenger returned before the morning fire had burned down to coals. Bettina stood in the doorway of Seraphine's study with the expression of someone who has just carried a lit torch through a room full of gunpowder and arrived, somehow, still breathing. She held out a second envelope. Same black wax, same tight, forward-pressing script on the outside. Lucien had not even waited for breakfast. Seraphine took it without standing. She broke the seal and read, "Tonight, 8 o'clock. Come alone." She set it face down on the desk. Outside the window, the river was gold with early light, moving the way it always moved, indifferent, continuous, carrying everything downstream without prejudice. She watched it for a moment and thought about what it meant that he had written back at all. A man with nothing to fear does not respond before sunrise. A man with nothing to hide does not use black wax. She picked up her pen and wrote 3 words. "I know you do." She did not explain. She sealed it and called Bettina back. "The same messenger?" "He's still at the gate, my lady. The Duke's man told him to wait." "Good." She handed over the envelope. "Tell him there will be no further correspondence today. The Duke may expect me this evening." Bettina hesitated. "My lady, are you certain? Going to the palace alone, after last night?" "Bettina." Seraphine looked at her directly. "If I were the kind of woman who avoided a room after causing a scene in it, last night would not have happened." Bettina left. Seraphine opened the hidden drawer. She spent the next 3 hours at her desk, not reading. She had read everything in that portfolio so many times she could reconstruct it from memory in the dark. She was sequencing, organizing the documents into the order she would need them, mapping the logical chain from first assumption to final proof, testing every link for weakness, the way a surgeon examines a suture before closing a wound. The work was detailed and cold, and she did it with the focused quiet of someone who has learned that emotion is a resource with a finite supply and that spending it on preparation is wasteful when there will be so much more to spend on execution. At noon, her father appeared in the doorway. He looked as though he had not slept. The skin beneath his eyes had the gray, compressed quality of old stone, and his hands, usually steadied by habit and brandy and the long practice of hiding his tremor, were visibly unsteady at his sides. "You said last night," he began. "Sit down, father." He sat. She turned from the desk to face him. She looked at Edmund Vale, at the man her father had been before grief and Lucien's slow economic strangulation had made him into what he was now, and she tried to find the version of him she had grown up believing in. The man who had taught her to ride, to read contracts, to identify the moment in a negotiation when the other party had already decided against you and was simply waiting for you to catch up. That man was still in there, buried under 2 years of loss and brandy and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a war you have already privately conceded. She needed him back. She needed him functional. She was about to hand him information that would either destroy him completely or reconstruct him from the inside out, and she had no way of knowing which it would do before she handed it over. She told him everything. She laid it out in sequence, methodically, without drama. She told him about the clerk at Lucien's banking house who had approached her 14 months earlier, a small, nervous man named Petrie who had come to the side entrance of Vale House on a Tuesday evening and asked to speak privately. She told him what Petrie had shown her, duplicate ledgers, 2 sets of accounts running parallel beneath the official records, funds moving in patterns that made no sense under any legitimate interpretation, but made perfect sense under one specific illegitimate one. She told him about the contracts, 3 of them signed under names that did not appear in any noble registry, but that corresponded when traced through a chain of property records she had spent 6 weeks following to men who worked directly for Lucien's household. She told him about the letter from Lord Ashwick, an elderly ally of the Vale family, long since isolated from them by Lucien's political maneuvering, who had written to her 3 months ago from his estate in the north, confirming that he had been present at a dinner 18 months before Marcus's death, at which Lucien had discussed the Vale family's Eastern River holdings with an intensity that Ashwick had found unusual enough to document. Edmund's face had gone very still. He was listening the way a man listens when he knows the next sentence will contain something he cannot unknow. Seraphine told him about the river crossing. She told him about the map with the red mark. She told him about the testimony, written by a ferryman who worked the crossing that night, a man named Krail, who had seen two riders on the bank before the accident, seen them leave after, and who had spent the following year drinking himself toward an early grave before a woman in black velvet had found him in a riverside tavern and offered him something more valuable than guilt. Documentation. Witness protection. A formal record of what he had seen, notarized by a lawyer whose loyalty lay not with the Duke of Ashworth, but with the family of the woman now sitting across from Edmund Vale, watching her father come apart and rebuild himself simultaneously. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Edmund did not cry. She had expected him to. Instead, he sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the space between them with an expression that was not grief and not rage, but something between the two. The specific face of a man who has been confirmed in a suspicion he has been calling paranoia for 2 years, who has just learned that the instinct he suppressed to preserve his own sanity was correct all along, and that suppressing it cost him the chance to act when action might have made a difference. "How long," he said, "have you known?" Suspected 18 months, known with enough certainty to act 3 weeks. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed you sober to hear it, and I wasn't certain you would be. I'm sorry." He took the apology the way he took everything now, without comment, absorbing it into the general weight he was already carrying. He looked at his daughter. He looked at her for a long time in the way of a man recalibrating a fundamental measurement. "What is tonight?" he asked. "The first move. He'll try to buy you. He'll try to frighten me first. When that doesn't work, he'll try to buy me. When that doesn't work..." She paused. "That's where it gets interesting." Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need from me?" "Stay here. Don't drink. And if I am not home by midnight, send the portfolio to Lord Ashwick by private courier. He will know what to do with it." He nodded. Once, the nod of a man accepting a role he had not expected to play. Not the protector, not the patriarch, not the one who rides out to meet the threat, but the keeper of the evidence, the holder of the line, the one who stays behind and makes sure the work survives, even if the person who built it does not. It was not a heroic role. He took it anyway, and the taking of it seemed to straighten something in him that had been bent for a long time. The afternoon passed. Seraphine dressed at 7. Not black this time, deep green, the color of deep water, of old forests, of things that have been alive long enough to develop their own stillness. She wore the emerald earrings that had belonged to her mother, the one piece of jewelry she had never considered throwing into any river, because her mother had worn them on the day she had faced down a room of hostile creditors and walked out with 3 concessions and her family's dignity intact. The earrings were not decorative. They were a record, a reminder. This is what the women of this family do when they walk into rooms that want to consume them. The palace at night was a different creature than the palace at dawn. The banquet debris had been cleared. The spilled wine, the scattered flowers, the long smear across the marble that Seraphine did not let herself look at too directly as she was escorted through the side entrance and down a corridor she had not used before. Not the public halls, the private wing, Lucien's territory, the parts of the palace where the candles were fewer and the walls held not portraits but maps. The room where he received her was a study. Dark wood paneling, a fire burning high, books that had been arranged for impression rather than use, a desk of imperial proportions behind which Lucien Draven stood, not sat, stood, when she entered, and the fact that he was standing told her he had considered the psychology of the meeting more carefully than the simple dominance display of the furniture arrangement would suggest. Standing meant he could move. Standing meant he had not yet decided what kind of conversation this was going to be. She walked in and stood on the opposite side of the desk and looked at him across 8 feet of polished mahogany and said nothing. He looked at her for a moment. His expression was closed in the way of a man who has spent the day deciding on a strategy and has arrived at one he is not entirely certain about. "You look," he said, "remarkably composed for someone who committed assault in front of 400 witnesses." "I look," Seraphine said, "exactly the way I feel." "And how is that?" "Finished waiting." Something shifted in his expression. Not the curiosity from last night, something more controlled than that, more deliberate. He moved around the side of the desk, not toward her but alongside it, and she tracked the movement without turning her head, keeping him in her peripheral vision the way one keeps a door in sight when the room is unfamiliar. Seraphine. He used her name without the title. The intimacy of it was calculated, designed to remind her that there had been a time when the removal of formality between them had meant something different than it meant now. What you did last night cannot be undone. You understand that. I understand it completely. The Vale family's standing. What remains of it? What remains of it, she said, has nothing to do with what I did last night. What remains of it has everything to do with what you have been doing for 6 years, and we both know that. The pause that followed was the first pause in the conversation that had not been a tactical choice. It was a real pause. The pause of a man hearing something he had not expected to be said out loud. In his calculation of this meeting, she had been a variable with a known range. A woman cornered. A woman who had made a spectacular, emotionally destructive error in public and who now needed to be managed, either controlled back into compliance or, if that proved impossible, neutralized through the leverage he had been carefully assembling for years. In either version of this meeting, she arrived frightened or defiant but fundamentally reactive. She arrived responding to him. She was not responding to him. "You've been building something," he said, quietly. The curiosity was back, but it had sharpened into something colder. "Haven't you?" "I've been building several things." "Show me." "Not tonight." He moved. Not aggressively. He was too controlled for the aggressive version of this, but deliberately, closing the distance between them by 3 feet in a single smooth step, occupying space in the way of a man who has always used physical presence as the first language of power. He was close enough now that she could see the texture of his jacket, the careful press of his collar, the slight tension in his jaw that he was not quite successfully concealing. She did not step back. She held the ground and met his eyes and breathed. Slow, even. A breath that said her body was not responding the way bodies respond when fear takes over. He noticed. She watched him notice. "What do you want?" he said. "The truth," she said. "About Marcus." 3 seconds. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the palace a door closed. Lucy and Draven stood 18 inches from Seraphine Vale and held her gaze and did not blink and said absolutely nothing, and it was the most articulate silence she had ever heard from a human being, packed dense with calculation, with assessment, with the rapid, ruthless triage of a man sorting through possible responses and discarding them one by one. "Marcus drowned," he said. "It was a tragedy. It was a murder," she said, "and I have a witness." She watched his face do something she had never seen it do in 6 years of knowing him. It stayed still. He was exceptional at stillness. It was one of his primary weapons. But beneath the stillness, something shifted, something foundational, the way a building shifts when the ground beneath it moves. Not visible collapse, not even visible stress, just a tremor, deep and brief and devastating in its implications. "You are making," he said very carefully, "an extraordinarily dangerous accusation." "I'm making an extraordinarily documented accusation. There's a difference. The dangerous version is undocumented. The documented version is simply true." He turned away from her, not in defeat. She did not read it that way. In recalculation. He walked to the fire and stood with his back to her, looking into the flames, and she watched the line of his shoulders and the set of his spine, and understood that she was watching a man restructure his approach to a problem that had just changed shape entirely beneath his hands. "What do you want?" he said again, to the fire this time. The question had a different weight in this direction. The first time he had asked it, he was offering terms. This time he was asking a genuine question. He wanted to understand her. He needed to understand her. Men like Lucian Draven are not frightened by strength or intelligence or even evidence. They are frightened by the thing they cannot map, the variable that refuses to behave like a variable, the piece on the board that moves in patterns they have not anticipated. "I want what was taken from my family," Seraphine said. "I want the contracts voided, the accounts restored, the Eastern holdings returned, and I want the name of every man who was on that riverbank the night my brother died." He turned back. His expression had settled into something she recognized. The controlled, calculating blankness of a man who has decided that the meeting has gone past the point where emotion is useful and into the territory where only strategy matters. She recognized it because she had been wearing the same expression since she walked through his door. "And if I refuse? Then tomorrow morning, a leather portfolio leaves Vale House by private courier. Its destination is Lord Ashwick's estate in the north. Its contents will reach the Royal Council within the week. Its contents will also reach 3 newspaper editors, 2 foreign ambassadors, and the magistrate of accounts, who I understand has been looking for a reason to audit the Draven estate for the past 14 months. She paused. You have until midnight. The fire popped. Lucian looked at her, really looked at her, in the sustained, unguarded way that people rarely allow themselves in confrontation because it requires setting down every performance and being simply, nakedly present in the reality of a situation that is not going the way it was supposed to go. You would destroy yourself along with me, he said. The scandal, your family's name dragged through a public trial. My family's name, Seraphine said, has been dragged by your hands for 6 years. I am very comfortable with drag at this point. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite its opposite. It was the expression of a man who, somewhere beneath the calculation and the threat and the acute awareness of danger, is experiencing something that functions like respect, the involuntary, unwanted, entirely honest recognition of a force that meets his own. He hated it. She could see that he hated it. I need time, he said. You have until midnight. She turned and walked to the door. Her hand was on the handle when his voice reached her, low, stripped of performance, carrying something in it she had not expected to hear. Seraphine. She stopped. She did not turn. How long have you been planning this? A moment. The fire. The dark. The palace breathing around them. Since the morning after Marcus's funeral, she said, when you attended in full mourning dress and looked at me across his grave, and I saw in your eyes that you were not grieving. You were calculating what came next. She opened the door and walked out. The corridor was long and dim, and her footsteps were the only sound in it. She walked steadily, her shoulders level, her breathing controlled. She did not let herself feel anything yet. Not relief, not triumph, not the nauseating, vertiginous lurch of having placed everything she had built in the last 2 years on the table in a single conversation and waited to see whether the table would hold. She was nearly at the end of the corridor when she heard it. A door. Behind her. Not the study door. A different door. One of the side passages that ran between rooms in this part of the private wing, built for servants and discretion and the kind of movement that powerful men require to be invisible. The door opened softly, and then closed, and then there were footsteps. Quiet, deliberate, not the footsteps of a servant. Seraphine did not stop walking. She did not turn around. She counted the footsteps behind her. 1, 2, 3. Calculating the distance, the pace, the angle of intercept, the question of whether what was following her was a message or a threat. A hand closed around her arm. She turned and stopped. The man holding her arm was not one of Lucian's guards. He was young, mid-20s, with a face she did not recognize and eyes that held the specific controlled blankness of someone performing a task they have been paid to perform without being told why. In his free hand, he held a folded piece of paper. From a friend, he said, and released her. He walked back down the corridor and disappeared through the side passage before she could ask anything. She looked down at the paper in her hand, unfolded it. 4 words. No signature. Handwriting she did not recognize. He has the ferryman. The floor did not move. The walls did not close. Seraphine stood in the dim corridor of Ashworth Palace at 10 minutes past 8 in the evening and read 4 words that told her that somewhere between the moment she had left the Riverside Tavern 3 weeks ago and this exact moment, everything she believed about the security of her evidence had been wrong. Crele, the ferryman, the only living witness to what had happened on the river the night Marcus died. Lucian had him, which meant Lucian had known about the witness before she had walked into his study tonight, which meant every exchange in that room had been a performance conducted by a man who already held the card she believed was her final protection, which meant the offer she had made, the courier, the portfolio, the midnight deadline, had been heard not as a threat but as a confirmation. She had told him exactly what she had, and he had let her because he already knew. Seraphine's hand closed around the note. She looked at the wall in front of her. She breathed, 1 breath, 2, 3, and felt the situation reconfigure itself around her like a room rearranging its furniture in the dark, the familiar shapes of her plan becoming strange and treacherous underfoot. She had come into this palace tonight believing she held the stronger hand. She had been wrong, and the man in that study knew it. She stood in that corridor for exactly 11 seconds. She knew because she counted them, not from panic, but from the cold, mechanical habit of a woman who had learned that the mind, when flooded with information that contradicts everything it believed to be true, will seize if not given something simple and finite to hold on to. 1, 2, 3. The stone walls, the dim candles, the note in her hand. 7. 8. The sound of the palace breathing around her, indifferent and enormous. 11. Then she moved, not toward the exit. She was not ready to leave yet, because leaving with this information and no plan was the same as handing Lucien the remainder of the evening to consolidate whatever he had already built around Creil's capture. She moved instead toward the eastern corridor, the servants' passage she had memorized years ago during one of the interminable formal visits, when she had found that moving through the bones of a building told you more about its nature than any amount of time spent in its public rooms. She needed to think. She needed 4 minutes and a quiet wall, and the eastern corridor had both. He has the ferryman. The note had no signature, which meant she could not verify its source, which meant she had to treat it as either genuine intelligence or a second layer of manipulation. A secondary move designed to destabilize her after the meeting, to send her scrambling in a direction that served Lucien's purpose rather than her own. She turned it over both ways, testing each interpretation, and found them both plausible, which was exactly the kind of situation she had spent 2 years trying to avoid through meticulous preparation. The preparation had failed. Something had failed, and she needed to understand where the failure was before she could build anything new from what remained. She thought about Creil, the ferryman. She had found him in a riverside tavern 15 months ago, and she had spent 6 weeks establishing trust before she asked him anything. She had paid for the notarization herself, through a lawyer named Voss. Quiet, expensive, with an office above a bookshop 3 streets from the river. She had taken the document and placed it in the portfolio, and she had told no one. Not Bettina. Not her father. No one. No one. Which meant the information had not come from anyone she had told. Which meant Lucien had found Creil through independent means, through his own investigation, running parallel to hers, following the same river backward toward the same crossing. Which was possible. Lucien had resources she could not match. He had people in every corner of the city. Or it meant something else, something she did not want to look at directly yet. She left the palace through the servants' exit and walked to the carriage without hurrying. She told the driver to take the long route home, along the river road, and she sat in the dark and unfolded the note one more time and looked at the handwriting. She looked at it for a long time. 4 words. He has the ferryman. The letters were small and controlled, right slanting, the vowels slightly compressed, the handwriting of someone educated in a formal tradition, someone who had learned their letters from a tutor rather than a schoolroom. The paper was good quality, not palace quality, but good. And the fold was precise, a single horizontal crease, clean and centered, the fold of someone who forms habits around small tasks without thinking about it. She had seen that fold before. She closed the note. She closed her eyes. The carriage moved along the river road and the water was black and reflective, and she felt the recognition settling into her chest like cold water finding the lowest point in a vessel. Slow, inevitable, going exactly where gravity directed it, regardless of what the vessel would prefer. Her father. The fold. She had seen it on the letters her father wrote to his solicitor, to his land agents, to the men who managed the Vale accounts. Small, precise, horizontal. The fold of a man who had spent 40 years conducting correspondence with the meticulous care of someone who understood that documents were a form of permanence, and permanence required precision. She had watched him fold letters at that desk 1,000 times. She knew the fold the way she knew his voice. She told herself she was wrong. She told herself she was catastrophizing, that the mind under pressure generates false patterns from incomplete data, that a fold in a piece of paper was not evidence of anything. She told herself all the reasonable things and felt none of them land. Vale House was dark when the carriage arrived, except for the study. The study window glowed amber, the same as always, her father's vigil light burning against the dark the way it had burned every night since Marcus died. Seraphine went in through the front door and walked directly to the study and opened it without knocking. Edmund Vale was at his desk. The brandy was untouched beside him. She noted this, gave it its due weight as evidence. He was sitting very still with his hands flat on the desk surface, in the posture of a man who has been waiting and who is not surprised to be found waiting. He looked up at her when she entered. She looked at him. 3 seconds of silence, and in those 3 seconds something happened between them that had no language. A communication conducted entirely in the register of recognition, of 2 people who know each other at a level that precedes words, encountering the moment when that deep knowing becomes the most painful thing in the room. "You sent someone to the palace tonight," Seraphine said. Edmund did not answer immediately. He looked at his hands on the desk. He looked at them the way a man looks at his hands when he is asking them to carry something they were not built to carry. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me I'm wrong." "Seraphine, tell me I'm wrong, Father. Tell me you did not tell Lucien about Crail. Tell me you did not go behind my back and give him the one piece of this that he needed." Edmund closed his eyes. One breath. Two. When he opened them again, they were the eyes of a man who has moved past the stage of rehearsing explanations and into the stage of simply enduring what comes next. "It wasn't Lucien," he said. The room was very quiet. "Then who?" Seraphine said, and her voice was the flat, uninflected voice of someone managing a response so extreme that the body has bypassed the emotional register entirely and gone straight to function. It was Harlan Voss, the lawyer, her lawyer, the man she had paid for the notarization, the man who had the only copy of the testimony she had not kept herself. "Voss works for Lucien," she said. "Voss has worked for Lucien for 11 years. I found out 8 weeks ago." Edmund's voice was steady in the way that a voice becomes steady when the person has already said the words to themselves so many times that the emotional charge has been partially discharged. "I should have told you. I know that. I didn't tell you because I was trying to find another way. I thought if I went to Lucien directly, if I offered him, I thought there was a negotiation to be had that would protect you without—" "You went to Lucien directly." She said it like reading a sentence that keeps failing to resolve into meaning. "You went to the man who had our ferryman, who murdered Marcus. You went to him and offered him what, exactly?" Edmund's hands moved on the desk, a small, involuntary contraction. "The portfolio," he said. "Or rather, I told him the portfolio existed. I told him its contents. I offered him the original documents in exchange for a settlement, for the contracts, for the money, for your safety." Seraphine sat down, not because she chose to, but because her body made the decision independently, the joints executing the movement before the conscious mind had finished processing what it was hearing. She sat in the chair across from her father and looked at the man who had raised her and educated her, and who had, in the grip of his own terror and grief and the desperate arithmetic of a man watching everything collapse, handed her greatest weapon to the enemy she had built it to destroy. "He turned you down," she said. "He took the information and turned me down. He said there was nothing to settle. He said the Vale family had no leverage. He said—" Edmund stopped. Something moved across his face. Not shame, which she had expected, but something rawer than that. Something that looked like the specific expression of a man who has just understood, fully and finally, the nature of the trap he walked into. "He said you would find out. He said it didn't matter if you found out, because without Crail's testimony and without the element of surprise, the portfolio was just paper." "Just paper." Seraphine looked in the far wall. She looked at the portrait of Marcus, her brother's painted face, still young, still confident, still permanently 24. She looked at it and thought about what it cost to build something carefully over 2 years, to lay each piece with precision and patience, to test every connection and verify every source, to walk into a room believing you hold the stronger hand, and then to discover that the foundation you built everything on had a crack you never found, because the crack was not in the evidence or the strategy or the plan, but in the person you trusted with the knowledge that it existed. She did not blame her father. That was the thing that surprised her, the absence of blame. She had expected rage and found instead something quieter and more devastating. The recognition that her father had done what frightened men do when the walls close in. He had tried to negotiate with the thing that was crushing him. He had believed, as frightened men do, that the enemy who holds the power will behave reasonably when offered a reasonable exchange. He had been wrong in the specific, catastrophic way that reasonable people are always wrong about unreasonable power. "He's going to move against us," she said, "tonight or tomorrow. Now that he knows the shape of everything we have, he knows what to neutralize and in what order." "Seraphine, I'm sorry, stop. Not cruel, just precise. I need to think, and I need you to let me think without spending the next 10 minutes managing your guilt. Can you do that?" Edmund closed his mouth. He nodded. She sat and thought. The portfolio without Crail's testimony was, as Lucy said, mostly paper. The bank records were suggestive but not conclusive, without a witness who could place Lucien's men at the crossing. The contracts with the false names could be explained away by a team of lawyers who had been explaining away Draven inconveniences for decades. Lord Ashwick's letter was circumstantial. The memory of an old man at a dinner table, remembering a conversation that had no explicit content. Without the ferryman's testimony, the chain of proof had a gap directly at its center. The gap that connected Lucian's financial maneuvering to the specific act of Marcus's death. Everything else was architecture around an absence. But she sat with that word. But there was always a but, and she had always believed that, had built her entire approach on the conviction that power is never as complete as it presents itself, that every fortress has a wall that was built with slightly less attention than the others, that the gap in her proof was also a gap in Lucian's certainty, because Lucian could not be certain how much she had built around Creel's testimony. He knew the testimony existed. He did not necessarily know what else existed, unless her father had told him that too. She looked at Edmund. How specific were you when you went to him? How specifically did you describe the contents of the portfolio? Edmund's expression told her before his mouth did. All of it, she said. I listed the documents by category, the bank records, the contracts, Ashwick's letter, the testimony. I was trying to demonstrate the weight of what we had. You thought you were negotiating from strength. The words came out without bitterness. They were just true. You were negotiating from exposure. The silence that followed had a different quality than the earlier silences. It was the silence of a situation that has reached its floor, the point below which there is no further descent, only the specific, clarifying stillness of having lost everything you came in with and knowing it. Lucian knew the full contents of the portfolio. He had the ferryman. He had 11 years of Voss's loyalty. He had the resources to challenge or bury every document she possessed. And he had, in the meeting tonight, allowed her to lay out her threat in full detail while already holding its dismantlement in his hands. She thought about his face in that study, the stillness, the recalculation she had watched behind his eyes. She had read it as the response of a man absorbing a threat he had not anticipated. She understood now that she had been watching a performance, a man confirming the dimensions of something he had already mapped. He had let her feel powerful. He had let her walk out of that room believing she had landed the first blow in a war she had chosen and prepared for, because a woman who believes she has struck first is a woman who is not watching for the counterpunch. She stood up. Where are you going? Edmund said. I need the names, Seraphine said. She was already at the door, already moving through the calculation in real time, stripping the plan down to its components and looking at what survived the damage. Every person who has had contact with this family in the last 2 years, every name that touched the edges of what we were building, the lawyer, the banking clerks, anyone at Ashwick's estate who knew the letter was sent, anyone at the tavern where I found Creil. I need a complete map of the exposure. Seraphine, it's past 10, and Lucian has the ferryman and my lawyer and 11 years of groundwork and the knowledge that my father offered to sell him our evidence. So yes, father, it is past 10. She stopped in the doorway. She looked back at him. She looked at the old man in the chair behind the desk that had belonged to his father and his grandfather. And she looked at Marcus's portrait on the wall. And she looked at the brandy untouched beside him, and she felt, for one sharp and involuntary moment, the full weight of everything this family had been, and everything it had been made into, and everything that had been taken from it, not by bad luck or misfortune, but by the deliberate, systematic, patient work of a man who had decided years ago that the Vale name was a resource to be extracted and discarded. The moment passed. She let it pass. She did not have the luxury of sitting inside it. I am not finished, she said. But what I had is gone, so I need to build something new. Tonight. She left the study and went to her room and sat at her desk and opened the hidden drawer and took out the portfolio and laid every document flat across the surface and looked at them. Not with despair, not with the stunned paralysis of someone surveying the wreckage of a plan, but with the cold surgical attention of someone identifying what can be salvaged and what must be abandoned. The bank records, still useful, directionally, not as proof, but as a map. They showed patterns of movement that would be interesting to anyone who knew what they were looking at, even if they could not independently prove intent. The contracts with the false names. Thin. But the names themselves were a thread that could be pulled, and Lucian could not know how far she had already pulled it, whether she had found the men behind the names, whether those men had their own reasons to be nervous about Lucian's empire at this particular moment. Ashwick's letter. Old. Circumstantial. But Ashwick was still alive, and Ashwick, she now remembered, had mentioned in his letter, almost as an aside, a detail he considered minor, that he had not been the only witness to that dinner. He had said a man named Pryor had also been present, a military man. Retired now. Living in the city. Seraphine had not followed up on Pryor. She had not needed to at the time because Crail's testimony had been the cornerstone and everything else was supplementary. She had noted the name and moved on. She pulled out a clean sheet of paper and wrote the name down. Pryor. Military. City. She had no proof anymore that would hold in a formal proceeding. What she had were threads, damaged threads, partially unraveled, their connections exposed and some of them cut. She needed to work differently now, not building a case from documents, building a case from people, from the network of men and women who had been standing in the radius of Lucien's decisions for years, absorbing the impact of them, developing their own complicated feelings about the things they had witnessed and been required to stay silent about. Lucien's power was wide. She had been trying to attack its width. She needed instead to find its depth, the places where it was thin, the places where a name whispered in the right ear would crack something that 20 documents could not. She worked until 3 in the morning. When she finally stopped, she had a list of 11 names. Some she recognized, some she would need to find. One, near the bottom of the list, written last, after a pause in which she had sat for nearly 10 minutes with her pen motionless above the paper, was the name she had been reluctant to write, because writing it made it real, and making it real meant accepting that the shape of the fight she was in was fundamentally different from the shape she had believed it to be. The name was Viola Marchand, not the girl she had dragged across the banquet floor, not the prop, the father. Baron Marchand of the Eastern Provinces, who had, if Ashwick's letter was to be believed, attended the same dinner where Lucien had discussed the Vale holdings with unusual intensity, who had said nothing, publicly, in the 24 months since Marcus's death, who had offered his daughter to Lucien's household in the same season that Lucien's grip on the eastern trade routes had tightened in ways that were, considered from a distance, suspiciously favorable to the Marchand family's shipping interests. Not an innocent father trading a daughter for a duke's attention. A partner. A man who had bought his family's safety with his knowledge of what had happened on the river, and who had been paying the ongoing cost of that safety in silence ever since. Seraphine looked at his name on the list. A man who knew what Lucien had done. A man who had reason to fear exposure if the truth came out. A man who had, therefore, every incentive to keep quiet. And also, she understood now, every reason to be terrified of the woman who had dragged his daughter across the marble floor of a royal banquet in front of 400 witnesses without a trace of hesitation. She had frightened him without knowing she was frightening him. She could use that. She blew out the lamp and sat in the dark with the list in her hands and felt the shape of the new plan beginning to emerge, different from the first plan, smaller in some ways and more dangerous in others, built not on documents but on human beings, and the specific terror that lives in people who have done something they cannot take back and have been waiting ever since for the knock on the door that means someone has found out. She would be that knock. But before she could move on any of the names, she needed to know one thing. The thing the note had not told her, the thing that determined the entire timing of whatever came next. She needed to know if Crail was still alive, because Lucien had the ferryman. But having a witness and having silenced a witness were two different conditions, and the distance between them was exactly the size of the window she had left to work in. She stood, moved to the window, looked out at the river. Black water. Moving always downstream, carrying always the same indifferent load of silt and secret and dissolved evidence of things that were never meant to surface. Then, from downstairs, a knock at the front door. Hard, rapid. The knock of someone who has been running. Seraphine was moving before it finished, down the stairs and across the entry hall, and when she pulled the door open, the figure on the threshold was not a palace messenger or one of Lucien's men, but a woman. Young, in plain clothes, her face pale and her hair loose, and her eyes carrying the wide, blown-out expression of someone in the grip of an adrenaline that is not yet converted into coherent thought. Viola Marchand, standing at the door of Vale House at 3 in the morning, her hands shaking, her white dress from the banquet replaced by a traveling cloak that was too large for her and had been put on in a hurry. She looked at Seraphine. Seraphine looked at her. Between them was the full unspoken weight of the banquet hall, of marble floors and screaming and the specific violence of the public humiliation that had passed between them 2 nights ago. "I know where he's keeping him," Viola said. Her voice was the voice of someone who has made a decision they cannot take back and who has not yet decided whether it was the right one. "The ferryman. I know where Crail is." She held out a folded piece of paper. "And I know what my father did." Seraphine looked at Viola Marchand for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then she stepped back from the door. Come in. Viola crossed the threshold with the careful movement of someone walking into a room that might close around them. She was younger than she had seemed in the banquet hall, or perhaps she had simply seemed older there, propped up by the white silk and the borrowed confidence of a woman who believed she was standing on solid ground. Here, in the entry hall of Vale House at 3 in the morning, she was 20 years old and frightened, and had apparently made a decision in the last several hours that had stripped away every performance and left only the raw fact of her. Seraphine led her to the study. Edmund was still there, still at his desk, and he looked up when they entered, and his expression moved through surprise and landed on the particular wariness of a man who has already caused enough damage tonight and is not certain what the next surprise will cost. "Leave us," Seraphine said. Edmund left without argument. Seraphine closed the door. She stood beside the desk and looked at Viola, who had not sat down, who was standing in the center of the room with the folded paper still extended in her hand, as though she had forgotten she was holding it. "Sit," Seraphine said, "and tell me everything from the beginning." Viola sat. She put the paper on the desk between them. She looked at her hands for a moment, then at Seraphine, and she began. She had overheard a conversation. 3 nights ago, the night before the banquet, her father had come to the rooms Lucian had arranged for them at the palace, and he had not known she was awake, and he had spoken to a man she did not recognize through the barely open door, and the words she had caught were not complete but were enough. Enough to know that a man named Crail had been moved, enough to know the location, enough to understand from the tone of her father's voice the specific compressed terror of a man maintaining composure while something enormous threatens to collapse on him. That this was not a conversation between allies, but between a man who held a debt and the man who owed it. She had spent the banquet day deciding whether to act on what she had heard. She had spent it watching Seraphine Vale walk into that hall in black velvet and silence, and she had watched what came next, not with the humiliation of the person it happened to, but with something adjacent to recognition, the stunned recognition of someone watching another person do the thing they have been too afraid to do themselves. "My father knew what happened to your brother," Viola said. She said it directly, without softening it, in the tone of someone who has decided the only way through the next 10 minutes is to keep moving forward without looking at the ground beneath them. "He was at the dinner where it was discussed. He didn't stop it. He didn't report it. He used what he knew to protect our family's trade agreements, and he has been using it ever since, and I did not know any of this until 3 nights ago." The room was quiet. "The paper," Seraphine said. Viola pushed it across the desk. Seraphine unfolded it. It was a location, an address, a warehouse district near the river's eastern bend, with a notation about a guard rotation written in Viola's small, careful hand. The handwriting of someone who had been educated properly and had spent 3 nights deciding what to do with that education. Seraphine looked at the address. She knew the district. She knew the warehouse. Not personally, but she knew who owned it. A shipping concern that appeared in the bank records she had spent months studying, one of the false name entities that connected, through 3 layers of corporate structure, back to the Draven estate. Crail was alive. He was an hour's ride from where she was sitting. "Why?" Seraphine said. Not a challenge. A genuine question. Viola looked at her steadily. "Because my father made a choice I cannot live in the shadow of. And because—" She paused. Something moved through her expression that was not quite courage and not quite guilt, but lived in the territory between them. "Because what you did in that ballroom was the first honest thing I have seen in this palace in 8 months, and I am very tired of dishonest things." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. She looked at the address. She looked at Viola. She ran the calculation. The possibility that this was a trap, that Lucien had sent Viola as a final move to drive Seraphine toward an isolated location where she could be dealt with cleanly and quietly. She tested the probability of that against the probability of a 20-year-old woman showing up at 3 in the morning with shaking hands and the specific exhausted expression of someone who has just finished burning their own life down. She made the decision. "Can you ride?" she said. "Yes." "Then change out of that cloak. I have something more practical." She was moving before she finished the sentence, out of the study, up the stairs, into her room, where she pulled a dark riding coat from the wardrobe and her boots from under the bed and the small leather case from the bottom of the hidden drawer, the one she had assembled 6 months ago when she had first begun to understand that the end game of what she was building might not be a courtroom. Inside the case, a folded document release authorization, signed and notarized by Voss before she knew Voss was compromised per sin. which meant Lucien probably didn't know it existed, and enough money to move a man and his family across 3 provincial borders. She came back downstairs to find Viola in the hallway, changed into riding clothes that had clearly been grabbed from a bag already packed, which told Seraphine that tonight had not been entirely impulsive. Some part of Viola Marchand had been preparing for this before she knocked on the door. Good. Edmund appeared from the study. He looked at his daughter, at the riding coat and the leather case, and he understood. "I'm coming," he said. "No. Seraphine, you are going to sit at that desk and you are going to write 3 letters, 1 to Lord Ashwick, 1 to the Magistrate of Accounts, 1 to the Foreign Ambassador at the Northern Embassy, whose name you will find in the second drawer under the household correspondence. You are going to tell each of them that you have information of serious national importance and that if you do not contact them again by noon tomorrow, they should take the action we discussed." She met his eyes. "We did not discuss it. You are going to decide what that action is, and it needs to be something that Lucien cannot stop with money or influence alone. Can you do that?" Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he straightened. "Not all the way. The body remembers its losses and does not fully recover them, but enough. Enough that she could see the man he had been underneath the man grief had made him." "Yes," he said. She held his gaze for one additional second, not to check him, but to let him see that she believed him. Then she turned and walked out the door. The night was cold and clear, and the city was almost entirely silent, the kind of silence that belongs to the hours after midnight and before dawn when the mechanisms of ordinary life are at their lowest ebb. She and Viola rode hard along the river road, hooves on wet stone, no conversation. Seraphine kept her eyes forward and let the cold air and the rhythm of movement do the work of clearing the residue of the last few hours, the study, her father's confession, the documents, the damage, stripping it back to the essentials. Trail. The warehouse. The guard rotation. If the rotation was accurate, there were 2 men at the entrance and 1 at the rear. 3 total. Armed presumably with the casual competence of men hired for containment rather than combat. Men who expected their presence to be sufficient deterrent, not men who expected to be tested. She was 2 women on horseback arriving in the middle of the night. The asymmetry was not ideal. She ran the scenario forward and found it manageable if, and only if, the element of surprise held for the first 30 seconds. After 30 seconds, if the guards had time to organize, it became something else. They reached the warehouse district at 20 minutes past 4. The river smell was heavy here. Industrial, chemical, the residue of cargo and commerce, and the contained energy of things in transit. The warehouses rose on either side of the lane like dark cliffs, their loading doors shut, their windows black. Somewhere in the distance, a dog moved through an alley and was briefly audible and then gone. Seraphine stopped her horse 2 buildings short of the address. She and Viola dismounted without speaking and tied the horses to an iron ring and stood for a moment listening. 2 guards at the front. She could see them from here, the orange point of a pipe being smoked, the shift and shuffle of men enduring a dull night. They were talking to each other in the low, automatic way of people who have run out of conversation but continue producing sound because silence is worse. She looked at Viola. "The rear guard," she said very quietly. "I need you to walk up to him from the south lane. Not running. Walking. Tell him Lucien sent you with a message. Give him no time to think about whether that's plausible. When he steps toward you, call out. 1 word. My name. Can you do that?" Viola looked at the warehouse, at the guards, back at Seraphine. The fear in her face was real and present, and she did not try to disguise it. Another thing Seraphine noted, because people who hide their fear are managing a performance, and performers make mistakes in the moments when the performance fails. Viola was not performing. She was just afraid and pushing through it, which was the only honest form of courage Seraphine had ever respected. "Yes," Viola said. "Give me 2 minutes to reach the north side." She moved. The dark between the buildings was nearly total. She kept one hand on the warehouse wall and counted her steps and breathed through her mouth and felt her heart doing what hearts do in these moments. The accelerated, primitive drumbeat of a body that has been informed by some deep subcortical mechanism that the next several minutes will determine something significant. She had felt it before. She had learned not to fight it. The heartbeat was information. It sharpened the edges of things, tightened the resolution, made the world vivid in the way it only gets when the stakes are sufficient to cut through the noise of ordinary consciousness. She reached the north corner. She waited. 1 minute. The guards at the front continued their low conversation. The river moved, the city breathed. Then from the south side, a voice. Young, female, steady. "Excuse me, I have a message from the Duke." Seraphine moved. She came around the north end of the building fast and low, and the guard at the front entrance turned toward the sound of Viola's voice, and his partner turned with him, the instinct of paired attention. Both looking south for the fraction of a second that was all she needed. She crossed the distance in 6 steps. The first guard heard her on the 5th step and started to turn, and she was already there. And the collision was not elegant. Her shoulder into his side, his pipe scattering orange sparks across the stone, his body going sideways and down. And then she had the door handle in her hand and it was unlocked. Unlocked because Lucien's men trusted the guards outside more than the lock itself. And the door opened and she was through it. "Seraphine," Viola's voice from behind her. One word, as instructed. Seraphine heard the second guard shout, heard the scuffle, heard Viola say something fast and sharp, and then the sound of running footsteps that were Viola's and not the guards. Inside the warehouse was dark and smelled of river water and old timber, and the particular closed-in cold of a large space with no ventilation. She could see shapes, crates stacked high, a crane mechanism overhead, a catwalk running the upper perimeter. At the far end, a small light. Oil lamp. A room or an enclosure made of partial walls. She ran toward it. The door in the partial wall was not locked. She pushed through and found a small space, a foreman's office repurposed, with a cot, a single lamp, and a man. Krail was alive. He was older than she remembered from the tavern, or perhaps he had simply aged in the way that captivity ages people, compressing time, drawing the face inward, adding weight to the eyes. He was sitting on the cot with his wrists bound in front of him with rope, not chains, and he was looking at the door with the expression of someone who has been told repeatedly that no one is coming and has been spending the hours since then methodically not believing it. He looked at her. She saw recognition move through him slowly, then faster. "Lady Vale," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Can you walk?" "Yes." She cut the rope with the knife from her boot. He stood. He was unsteady for a moment and then steadied, the body reassembling its competencies as fast as his circumstance demanded. She pushed the document release and the money from the leather case into his hands. "The name on the document is yours. The money is enough for 4 provincial borders. When you reach the Northern Territories, contact the name written on the inside cover of the document case. He will know what to do." Krail looked at the documents, at the money, at her. "They'll come after me." "Yes, which is why you need to be across the first border before morning." She moved back toward the door. "There's a rear exit south of here. Viola, the woman outside, will show you. Don't stop." She was back through the office door when she heard him say it. "Lady Vale." She stopped. "I'll testify," Krail said. "Whatever you need. Whenever you need it. I'll stand in front of any council you put me in front of and say what I saw." He paused. "I should have said it 2 years ago. I should have said it the morning after it happened. I was a coward." She looked at him over her shoulder. "You're saying it now." She moved. The warehouse floor was still dark. She made it back to the main entrance in 20 seconds, and the guards, she had taken the first one down, but he was up now, slower and angrier for the fall, were at the door, and the third guard from the rear had apparently come around the south side, which meant Viola had not delayed him as long as hoped, which meant the window was closing. 3 men, 2 of them between her and the exit. The first guard reached her before she reached the door. He was large and she was not, and the collision this time was not in her favor. His hand closed on her arm and her momentum converted into a spin, the arm wrenching, her back hitting the wall of stacked crates hard enough to scatter the breath from her lungs. The crates shifted. One came down and struck his shoulder, and he cursed and his grip loosened for just long enough. She went low, under his arm, through the door. The night air hit her like cold water. She was running before she could assess the damage to her arm. She would assess it later. There was a hot, insistent pain above the elbow that she catalogued and then set aside, the body's complaint filed and deferred. She ran the 2 buildings back to the horses and found Viola already there, already mounted, with Krail, moving faster than she had expected, coming from the south lane at something between a walk and a stumble. "Can he ride?" Seraphine said. "Behind me," Viola said. She reached down and Krail took her hand and got up with the particular graceless urgency of a man rediscovering his body's capabilities under pressure. Seraphine mounted. She looked back. One of the guards was at the corner of the building, shouting, not at them, but back into the warehouse, calling for something. A horse, a signal, communication. Lucienne would know within the hour. They rode. The ride back through the city was different from the ride out. Faster, more reckless, taking the narrow lanes where mounted pursuit was difficult, cutting through the market district where the morning's early vendors were already setting up in the dark. Seraphine's arm burned with every stride of the horse, and she rode through it and did not think about it. She thought about what came next. Creel's testimony by itself was still not enough. A ferryman's word against a duke's infrastructure, in a royal council chamber where Lucien's allies sat on both sides of the table. She could hear the lawyers already, constructing the frameworks of doubt, the objections about chain of custody, and the credibility of a man found drunk in a riverside tavern who had, by his own admission, said nothing for 2 years. Testimony needed corroboration. Corroboration needed weight. Weight came from names, and names came from people who had enough to lose that their willingness to speak meant something. And the only name on her list who met that specific criterion was one she had not yet approached. Baron Marchand, who was presumably at this moment asleep or awake in his palace rooms, aware that his daughter had not come home tonight, beginning the slow, cold arithmetic of what that absence meant. She thought about what Viola had said in the study. My father made a choice I cannot live in the shadow of. She thought about the dynamics of a man who had built his family's safety on the price of his silence and who now had to calculate in real time whether that silence was still worth what he was paying for it, whether the structure he had built was strong enough to hold against a woman who had already dragged his daughter across a ballroom floor without blinking. The answer, she thought, might depend on what his daughter did next. They reached Vale House at 5:30. The sky to the east had begun its first grudging concession to dawn. Not light yet, but the faintest recession of absolute darkness. The sky's reminder that even the longest nights have a mechanism for ending. Edmund had the door open before they dismounted. His eyes moved over Seraphine. The riding coat, the arm held slightly differently than normal, the specific quality of alertness in her face that he recognized from her childhood as the expression she wore when she had done something difficult and was not yet ready to stop. The letters, she said. Sent. All 3? All 3, by separate couriers before 4 o'clock. She nodded. She looked at Creil, standing in her doorway, documents in hand, with the expression of a man who has been given back his life and does not yet know what to do with the weight of it. She looked at Viola, who was standing slightly apart, watching Seraphine with the focused, uncertain attention of someone who has just crossed a line they cannot uncross and is waiting to understand what territory they have walked into. There is a room in the east wing, Seraphine said to Bettina, who had appeared at the sound of hooves. Prepare it. Mr. Creil will rest for 2 hours, then leave before the city wakes. She turned to Viola. You, with me. She led Viola to the study. She closed the door. She stood behind her father's desk and looked at the young woman across it and felt the full, strange weight of the moment. The daughter of the man who had helped destroy her family, standing in what remained of her family home, having just helped her recover the witness who might rebuild it. Your father, Seraphine said. Does he know you're here? He will by morning. When he finds out, when Lucienne tells him what happened tonight, your father is going to have a choice to make. The same choice he made 2 years ago, but in reverse. She held Viola's gaze. I need to know which way he'll fall. Viola was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, thinking. The distinction mattered. He's not a cruel man, she said finally. He's a frightened one. There's a difference. I know the difference. The question is whether a frightened man will walk into a council chamber and say what he saw when the Duke who's been protecting him is sitting 15 feet away. I think, Viola said carefully, that my father might do something he would never do for his own sake, if he believed he was doing it for mine. Seraphine looked at her, looked at the directness in her, the careful construction of the sentence, the awareness of exactly what she was offering and what it would cost. You would ask him to. I would go to him this morning and I would tell him everything I did tonight, every choice, every step. Viola's chin came up in a way that was not arrogance, but its cleaner cousin, clarity. He would know that I have already made mine, and he would have to decide whether he wants to be on the same side of it as his daughter. The fire in the grate had burned to coals. The study held the specific exhausted warmth of a room that has been occupied through a long night. Outside, the first birds were beginning, tentative, testing the air for the cues that told them the dark was ending and the world was still there. Seraphine made the calculation. She ran every variable she had. Crail's testimony, Ashwick's letter, the bank records, Pryor's potential as a secondary witness. The three letters now moving through the city toward three recipients who would, if they had any instinct for self-preservation and justice, recognize what they held. She ran it all against the weight of what Lucien had. The lawyers, the allies, the council seats, the years of favors and compromises and debts that constituted the real architecture of his power. It was not enough. Not yet. Not without Marchand. She looked at Viola. One condition, Seraphine said. Name it. Your father testifies to what he saw at that dinner. Not a statement. Not a letter. In person. Before the full council. Where Lucien can see his face. She paused. That's the only version that counts. Viola held her gaze for 3 full seconds. She was doing her own calculation. Not of probability, Seraphine thought, but of something harder. Whether she could ask this of a man she had already upended. Whether the love between a father and a daughter was a force strong enough to move a man past the thing he had been built around for 2 years. Yes, she said. Not easily, not lightly. With the weight of someone accepting a cost they can see clearly and are choosing to pay anyway. Seraphine nodded once. Get some sleep, she said. 2 hours. Then you go to your father. She went to her own room and sat at the window and watched the dawn come up over the city. Gray first, then pink at the edges. The river catching the light and throwing it back in fragments. Her arm ached. She did not go to bed. She sat in the chair and watched the light build and thought about what the day would require. By noon, if everything held, the 3 letters would have been read. Ashwick would be moving. The magistrate would be asking questions in corridors, where Lucien's people would hear the questions and report them back, and Lucien would begin to understand the shape of the morning. He would move to contain it. He always moved to contain things. But containment requires time and information and the ability to predict which direction the threat is coming from, and by the time the sun was fully up, the threat was going to be coming from directions he had not mapped. It was not enough to destroy him. Not yet. But it was enough to make him afraid. And a man who is afraid makes different decisions than a man who is certain. A man who is afraid moves faster than is wise. A man who is afraid, in a single unguarded moment in a room full of people who have been watching him for years and waiting for exactly that moment, will do the thing that confirms everything. She was going to give him that room. The Royal Council was scheduled to convene in 4 days. She had 4 days to turn everything she had rebuilt in the last 6 hours into the kind of evidence that could survive a public proceeding. 4 days to prepare Crail, to prepare Marchand, to arrange the sequence of revelation so that each piece arrived in the order that made the next piece inevitable. 4 days. She stood. She moved to her desk. She picked up her pen. Downstairs she heard Viola's door close. The house settled into the particular quiet of 3 people sleeping in exhausted proximity, held together by necessity rather than anything warmer, bound by the specific gravity of a situation that was not finished and would not be finished until it was finished completely. Seraphine began to write. She was mid-sentence when the sound reached her, not from inside the house, but from the street, from the direction of the gate, the sound of horses arriving at a deliberate pace, not fast but purposeful, the sound of official movement at 6 in the morning. She stood, went to the window. 4 horses, 6 men on foot. The livery of the ducal household, not the palace, not the crown, but Draven's personal guard, in the dark green and silver that she had seen outside his residence 100 times over 6 years of engagement visits and social obligations, and the long, slow performance of a betrothal that had never been anything other than a transaction. And at the front of the group, on the largest horse, in full morning dress, as though he had not slept or had simply decided that sleep was an irrelevance tonight, Duke Lucien Draven. Looking up at the window where Seraphine stood, looking directly at her, as though he had known precisely which window she would be standing at, as though the entire night had been a sequence he had been watching from a position she had never found. In his hand, visible even from this distance, was a folded document with the royal seal pressed in gold. Not the ducal seal. The royal seal. The king's seal. The document that could only mean one thing, an instrument that no letter to Ashwick, no testimony from a ferryman, no deposition from a minor baron could stop or delay or challenge in any court that existed in this kingdom. A warrant. Her father's voice from downstairs. Alarmed. Awake. He had heard the horses. Viola's door opening. The house coming awake around her like a body responding to a wound, all its systems suddenly redirected toward a single point of damage. Seraphine stood at the window and looked at Lucian Draven looking up at her, and in the 4 seconds before she turned to go downstairs and meet whatever was walking through her gate, she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not fear. She had moved through fear, not rage. Rage was a fuel she had already spent. She felt the specific, clarifying sensation of a person who has spent 2 years building toward a single moment and has just realized that the moment is here, that it is not the moment she planned for, that the ground beneath it is not the ground she mapped, and that the only relevant question remaining is whether she is, in fact, the woman she has been building herself into, or whether that woman is still just a version of herself she has not yet finished becoming. The horses stopped at her gate. Lucien did not dismount. He was waiting for her to come out. She went downstairs. Not running, not hurrying. She walked the stairs the way she had walked every difficult threshold in the last week, with the measured, deliberate pace of someone who understands that how you enter a room is the first statement you make in it, and that first statements, once made, cannot be taken back. Edmund was in the entry hall, his face the color of old paper, his hand on the door handle. He looked at her when she came down the stairs, and she saw in his eyes the specific terror of a man who has already caused the damage and is now watching it arrive at his door in the form of horses and green livery and a gold-sealed warrant. "Don't open it yet," she said. She went to the study. She opened the hidden drawer and removed the portfolio. She stood for a moment with it in her hands and looked at what 2 years of careful, solitary work felt like when held at 6 in the morning with official horses in the drive. It felt like paper. It felt like the most important paper she had ever held. Both things were true simultaneously, and neither resolved the other. She went to the entry hall. She looked at her father. "When I open this door," she said, "I need you to go upstairs and wake Viola. Tell her what is outside. Tell her that whatever she is going to do about her father, she needs to do it in the next 30 minutes, because after that, the shape of this morning will have already been decided." Edmund nodded. He went upstairs without speaking. She heard his footsteps, careful, deliberate, a man trying to walk with more steadiness than he felt. She listened to them go, and then she put her hand on the door and opened it. The morning air came in cold and carrying the river smell and the first real light of dawn, which had arrived while she was moving through the house and was now painting the drive in a pale gold that seemed almost ironic given the circumstances. Lucien's men stood in a line beyond the gate. Lucien himself was still mounted, the document in his right hand, his horse absolutely still in the way of a well-trained animal and a well-controlled rider. He looked at her standing in the open doorway with the portfolio under her arm, and something moved through his expression that was not quite surprise. "Lady Vale," he said, "you've had a productive night." "So have you," she said. "Come in." He looked at her for a moment. She saw him assess the invitation, the openness of it, the absence of the defiance he had probably expected, the specific quality of stillness in her face that was not defeat and not surrender, but something he had been trying to read correctly since the banquet and had not yet successfully mapped. He dismounted. He said something brief to the guard nearest him and walked through the gate alone, the warrant in his hand, and followed her inside. She led him to the study. The fire was cold now, the lamp still burning from the night's work. The desk covered in the organized remnants of everything she had rebuilt in the dark hours. She did not clear it. She stood behind it and watched him take in the room, the documents, the lamp, the leather case, the 2 chairs positioned across from each other in the arrangement of people who have been talking through a long night. He placed the warrant on the desk between them. She looked at it. She did not pick it up. "Read it," he said. "I know what it says." "Then you know it's signed by the Crown, not the Council, not a magistrate. The King himself, based on a formal complaint filed at midnight, alleging conspiracy against the nobility and interference with ducal proceedings." His voice was controlled, precise, the voice of a man delivering a legal instrument rather than a threat. "You have until noon to present yourself to the Crown Court, or the men outside will do it for you." Seraphine looked at the warrant. She looked at the seal, the real seal, the king's seal, pressed in gold wax with the precision of genuine authority. She felt the weight of it. She did not look away from it, because looking away would mean pretending it was smaller than it was, and she had not survived this far by pretending. "How long," she said, "have you had the king?" The pause that followed was 3 seconds long. In those 3 seconds, she watched Lucien make a decision about whether to deny it and saw him decide against denial, because they were past the stage where denial was useful. "Long enough?" he said. "Before Marcus." "Yes," she breathed. One breath. The kind of breath that crosses a distance, that carries you from one internal state to another, from the place where the information is still landing to the place where it has landed, and you are standing on it and deciding what to do next. Then you have more than I thought, she said. I have everything, Lucien said. And his voice, for the first time since she had known him, was completely without performance. Not cruel, not triumphant, simply honest. The flat, exhausted honesty of a man who has been maintaining an empire for so long that the maintenance itself has become the thing, and who has just now, in this gray morning study, said the truest sentence he has said in years. I have had everything for a long time. That is the problem with everything. It requires you to keep having it. Seraphine looked at him. She had spent 2 years building toward this man's destruction, and she was standing in the room where it was supposed to happen, and the room looked nothing like she had planned it. She had planned for a courtroom. She had planned for a council chamber, for witnesses and documents, and the formal machinery of institutional reckoning. She had not planned for 6 in the morning in her father's study, with the lamp burning low and a man standing across a desk telling her the truth, with the specific weariness of someone who has been lying for so long that the truth feels like setting down a weight that has deformed the body carrying it. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because you already know it. He looked at the portfolio under her arm. You know more than Voss reported. I realized that last night after you left. The documents your father listed. They were the ones you showed him. They weren't all of them. He was right. She had not shown her father everything. She had shown him the documents she was certain were secure. The others, the ones she had not yet verified, the threads she had not yet finished pulling, she had kept back, not from distrust, but from the instinct that had kept her alive through this entire process. Never put all of it in one place. The warrant, she said. If I walk into that court at noon, how long before they find a way to make the charges stick? Long enough for the council appointments to change, long enough for Ashwick to die of old age, long enough for a ferryman's testimony to become the memory of a man who is held against his will and may not be considered reliable. He said it without pleasure. He said it the way a man explains the architecture of a machine he built and has been running for a decade and no longer admires. I have lawyers who have done nothing else for 11 years. And the king owes me more than he can repay in this lifetime, and knows it. A pause. He signed the warrant because I asked him to. He would prefer not to be asked again. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. She was very still. The lamp flickered. Some draft from somewhere. The house breathing. And the light moved across the desk and the documents and Lucien's face and the warrant between them. And she watched the light move and felt something happening inside her that was not the thing she had expected to feel at this moment. She had expected the end of this to feel like victory. She had built it to feel like victory. She had imagined standing in a council chamber watching a duke lose everything, watching the architecture of his power dismantled piece by piece by the evidence she had assembled. And she had believed that standing inside that moment would constitute some form of completion, the closing of the wound that Marcus's death had opened, the settlement of a debt that had been accumulating against her family for years. But completion, she was understanding now, is not a place you arrive at by destroying what hurt you. Destruction is a beginning disguised as an end. It removes the source of pain without addressing the shape that pain is carved into the person who carried it, and the shape remains after the source is gone, empty and definitional and requiring something more complex than a warrant or a council vote to fill. Why did you come here yourself? She said. You could have sent the guards. He looked at her for a long moment. I came because I wanted to see if you had found another way. And if I had, then I would have wanted to know what it was. The honesty of that landed differently than she expected. It landed in the place where she kept the version of Lucien she had known before she knew what he was. The version she had not permitted herself to examine in 2 years, because examining it would have complicated the clarity she needed to build what she built. He was not a simple man. She had always known that. Simple men do not build the kind of empire he had built. They also do not come alone at dawn to the door of the woman they have spent years maneuvering, carrying a warrant they have not yet decided to use. Footsteps on the stairs. She heard them register. 2 sets. Her father. Viola. And then a 3rd set. Heavier. A man's gait, with a slight irregularity she recognized from a different night, a different door, a different decision. Baron Marchand walked into the study. He was a man of 50-something, wide-shouldered, with the face of someone who had spent decades eating well and sleeping badly. He looked at Lucy Yen. He looked at the warrant on the desk. He looked at his daughter, who had come to stand in the doorway behind him, and in the look that passed between father and daughter, brief, charged, containing the entire conversation that must have happened in the 20 minutes since Edmund woke her, Seraphine saw what Viola had believed was possible and had not been certain of until this moment. He had come. The frightened man had come. "Marchand," Lucien said. His voice had changed. For the first time since he walked through the door, it carried something that was not control. "Lucien." Marchand's voice was the voice of a man who has practiced a sentence until the emotion is out of it, and what remains is just the sentence. "I was at the dinner 2 years before Marcus Vale died. You discussed the Eastern River holdings. You used the words permanent resolution. I heard you say it, and I did not report it, and I have been paying for that silence with my family's security and my daughter's honor, and I am done paying." The room was absolutely still. Lucien looked at Marchand. He looked at Viola. He looked at Seraphine. He looked at the portfolio under her arm, and at the warrant on the desk, and at the window where the morning was coming fully into its light now, the gold burning off and the clear white of full day replacing it, the kind of light that shows everything in equal resolution without the mercy of shadow. "One man's memory of a dinner," he said, very quietly. "That is not—" "I have a second witness," Seraphine said. She opened the portfolio. She removed a single sheet, the letter she had written in the small hours, after Viola had told her about Pryor, the military man, Ashwick's unnamed companion at that dinner. The man she had not had time to contact, had not known she needed to contact, until the shape of the night had reorganized itself around her and shown her where the remaining gap was. She had written the letter and sent it with Edmund's third courier, not to Ashwick, not to the magistrate, but to a retired military officer on the eastern side of the city who had been waiting, she now understood, for exactly this kind of morning. The letter was not testimony. It was confirmation of availability. Pryor had written back in under an hour. Edmund had brought her the reply at 5 in the morning with shaking hands, without fully understanding what it meant. She had understood. She set the letter on the desk next to the warrant. 2 witnesses. The same dinner. The same words. Corroborating from independent positions, without prior contact, the fact of a conversation that had preceded a death by 23 months. Lucien looked at the letter. He looked at it for a long time. Something happened to his face in that time. It did not collapse. He was not the kind of man whose face collapses. But something in the architecture of it changed. Some fundamental load-bearing element shifted, and the result was not ruin, but something quieter and in some ways more final. The expression of a man understanding that the machinery he has been operating has reached the end of its operational tolerance. Not because it was broken, because it had simply run as far as it could run, and the ground ahead was different from the ground behind, and the machine was not built for it. He looked at Seraphine. "What do you want?" he said. The same question he had asked in his study, but this time it was not a negotiation. It was a genuine inquiry from a man who had, in the last 3 minutes, lost the warrant as a viable instrument and the king as an unqualified ally and 2 witnesses as suppressible variables. What he still had was the lawyers, the money, the network, the years of accumulated favor. What he no longer had was certainty. And Seraphine, standing in her father's study in the full morning light, with a portfolio of imperfect evidence and 1 damaged arm, and exactly 3 hours of sleep in the last 36, understood that this was the moment. Not the council chamber she had planned, not the formal, witnessed, institutionally sanctioned moment of public reckoning. This room, this morning, these 5 people standing in the specific gravity of everything that had accumulated between them, this was where it ended. The question was what ending she chose. She thought about Marcus. She thought about his face, warm and slightly amused, painted permanently 24. She thought about what he would have done in this room with these 5 people, and this particular configuration of power and damage and exhausted truth. Marcus had believed in systems. He had believed in the reasonable mechanics of justice and due process, and the idea that institutions, when presented with evidence of their own corruption, would choose correction over continuation. He had been wrong, and his wrongness had killed him. She thought about what she believed. "The warrant," she said. "Withdrawn." Lucien's jaw tightened. in exchange for the contracts, the Vale family's Eastern holdings returned in full, the financial records of the false name accounts surrendered to the magistrate of accounts with a full accounting of their purpose, and the name of every man who was on that riverbank the night Marcus died. If I give you those names, then we will have a documented record of what happened, signed, notarized, held by 3 independent parties, including one outside this kingdom's jurisdiction. She held his gaze. I'm not asking for your head, Lucian. I am asking for the truth, official, permanent, on record, so that Marcus's death is not a drowning accident in anyone's archive, so that the men who are on that bank answer for it through whatever process still has jurisdiction, so that my family's name carries what it has always carried, without the weight of what you put on it. The room was breathing, all 5 of them. She could feel it, the collective, careful respiration of people who have been moving very fast for a very long time and have arrived at a moment that requires absolute stillness. Lucien looked at the warrant. He picked it up. He held it for a moment. A document representing 11 years of accumulated royal debt, and the final instrument he had believed would end this. And then he folded it once, in the center, and placed it in his jacket pocket. My lawyers will require 3 days, he said. You have 2. He looked at her one more time. In his face, she saw the full, unmediated complexity of a man who was many things simultaneously, ruthless and intelligent, and capable of acts she could never forgive, and also, somewhere beneath all of it, a person who had made choices so long ago that he had stopped being able to see them as choices. She did not forgive him. She was not built for that kind of forgiveness yet, and she did not pretend otherwise. But she looked at him without the hatred she had been carrying, because hatred is a weight like any other, and she had decided somewhere in the small hours of the morning that she was done carrying weights that were not hers. He walked out of the study. She heard him cross the entry hall. She heard the front door open and close. She heard his horse move in the drive and the sound of the guard detail following, and then the gate, and then the distance swallowing everything until all that remained was the sound of the house and the river, and the morning fully arrived. Edmund sat down in his chair. He sat down the way a man sits when his legs have been making a decision his mind was pretending was optional. He put his hands on the desk and looked at them and said nothing. Viola stood in the doorway with her father's arm around her shoulders, or rather she was standing with her shoulder under his arm, supporting him in the specific way of a young person who has stopped waiting for the adult to recover and has simply become the thing the adult needs to lean on. Baron Marchand looked at Seraphine with the face of a man who has just done the most difficult thing he has ever done, and does not know yet whether he has done it in time to matter. It mattered, Seraphine said. To both of them, but she was looking at him when she said it. He closed his eyes for a moment, opened them, nodded once. They left together, the Baron and his daughter, back into the morning, back toward whatever conversation the rest of that day would require between them. Seraphine watched them go and thought about what it costs a person to choose the harder thing when the easier thing has been working for 2 years. And she thought about the specific courage of a young woman who had walked to a stranger's door at 3 a.m. with shaking hands and a folded piece of paper and everything necessary to burn down the safety her family had built on the wrong foundation. She went to her father. She sat across from him. Just the 2 of them now, in the study where they had sat across from each other 100 times, the desk between them covered in the remnants of the night. She looked at Edmund Vale, at his white hair and his old hands and the brandy he had not touched, and she felt the full weight of everything that had happened between them and chose deliberately and without pretending it was easy to set it down. When Marcus died, she said, I didn't grieve. I went straight to work. I thought that was strength. Edmund looked at her. I understand now, she said, that it was terror. If I stopped moving, I would have to feel how much was gone, and if I felt that, I was afraid I would not be able to build what needed building. She paused. I was wrong to keep you outside of it. I should have told you what I was doing, not to protect the plan, because you deserved to know. Edmund's hands moved on the desk. The small contraction she had seen before, but different now. Not the grip of a man bracing against something, but the movement of a man releasing it. Your mother, he said, would have kept me outside of it too. A pause. She would have been wrong in the same way. I recognized the instinct. He looked at his daughter. You have her eyes, not the color, the way they move in a room, the way they count. Outside, the morning had settled into its full, ordinary state. Carts on the road, birds in the garden, the river doing what rivers do. The day had begun in the way days begin after extraordinary nights, indifferent to the night's events, continuing on its own schedule, requiring nothing in particular from the people who had survived it. Seraphine stood. She picked up the portfolio. She went to the window and stood in the light that came through it. Clean, direct, the honest light of mid-morning, and she felt the shape of herself in it. Not triumphant, not destroyed, something more accurate than either. A woman standing in a house that was still standing, with a name that was still intact, with the evidence of what had happened to her brother now in the hands of people who had the independence and the authority to ensure it was not forgotten. It was not justice, not fully, not yet. Justice was a process and not a moment, and she understood now that she had been confusing the two, that she had been chasing the moment when it would be over and everything would be resolved and she could stop being the person who carries the thing. Justice did not work that way. It worked the way rivers work, slowly, continuously, carrying things downstream over time, without drama, without announcement, without the satisfaction of a single decisive moment that made everything before it make sense. But this was a beginning, a real one. Not the beginning she had planned, which had been built on perfect evidence and formal proceedings and the satisfying machinery of institutional reckoning. This beginning was messier, smaller, more human, built on a frightened man's last-minute courage and a young woman's shaking hands, and a ferryman who had spent 2 years in a riverside tavern carrying a truth too heavy to hold alone, and had finally, on a night when someone showed up to share the weight, let it go. It would be enough. She believed that. She chose to believe it because the alternative, the belief that nothing short of perfect justice constituted justice at all, was the belief that had kept her moving without stopping for 2 years and had nearly cost her everything. She turned from the window. She looked at her father. She looked at the room around her, the old desk, the old maps, the portrait on the wall, the lamp that had been burning since before she came downstairs and was now burning in full daylight, its flame nearly invisible against the brightness, still present, still lit, doing its work in conditions that no longer required it. She crossed to the lamp and blew it out. The study looked the same without it. Light came from the window. It was enough. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in early autumn, the grand ballroom of Ashworth Palace was lit again. Not for a banquet, not for a ducal celebration. For the formal installation of the restored Vale family holdings, attended by the royal council, Lord Ashwick, who had made the journey south despite his age, who arrived with the specific energy of a man who has been waiting a long time to appear at a specific occasion, and 300 members of the nobility who came, Seraphine understood, for different reasons. Some came because they had received letters. Some came because they had been watching and had decided, with the pragmatic accuracy of people who understand power's direction of travel, that the woman who had dismantled a duke in 6 weeks was worth being visible to. Some came because they were curious. Some came because they had always known and had been waiting for someone to finally make the knowing matter. She wore green, the same deep green as the night she had ridden to the warehouse. She stood at the center of the ballroom, the same marble floor, the same painted ceiling with its scenes of conquest, and she received the council's formal restoration of the Vale holdings and the quiet, official acknowledgement that the late Marcus Vale's death had been referred to the appropriate investigative authorities, and she listened to the language of institutions doing the work of institutions, slow and procedural and utterly without drama, and she found, to her own surprise, that she did not need the drama. The work was the thing, the outcome was the thing. The words in the record were the thing. She stood in the ballroom and watched the faces. The ones who bowed their heads when she caught their eye. The ones who looked away. The few who held her gaze and nodded with the specific acknowledgement of people who have been paying attention and are glad of the result. She looked at her father, standing near the wall with a glass of wine. He was actually drinking, speaking to Ashwick with the straightened posture of a man who has been given back something he had stopped expecting to receive. She looked at Viola, near the far end of the room. Invited, because it had seemed correct to invite her, because some things deserve acknowledgement regardless of their origins, standing slightly apart in the way of someone who is still learning the shape of the room she has chosen to stand in. Seraphine did not look for Lucian. He was not there. He was in his estate in the western provinces, stripped of his council seats and his royal proximity, his financial records in the possession of the magistrate, his lawyers negotiating the terms of cooperating with an investigation he could not stop. He still had money. He still had land. He was not destroyed. She had not set out to destroy him, in the end, and the end had reflected that intention accurately. She had set out to make the truth official. The truth was official. She walked to the edge of the room where the tall windows overlooked the garden. The night was clear and the river was visible in the distance, a dark line in the city's lights, moving always downstream, carrying everything forward, whether or not the people on its banks were watching. She thought about Marcus. She thought about him the way she had not been able to think about him in 2 years, not as a loss to be avenged, not as a case to be built, not as the wound that organized everything else around itself. She thought about him as a person, as her brother, as the man who had taught her that the world was fundamentally reasonable and who had been wrong in a way that had cost him everything, and who had still, she believed, been more right than wrong, not about the world, but about what it was worth trying to make the world into. The world was not reasonable. She had proof of that in 11 years of bank records and 1 gold-sealed warrant, but the effort to make it more reasonable, the careful, patient, expensive, exhausting effort of building truth into a form that could survive contact with power, that was not naive. That was the only honest work she knew how to do. She would keep doing it. Not because she had won. She had not fully won, and she knew it, and she was not performing uncertainty. She would keep doing it because the alternative was to become the thing she had been fighting, to decide that because power is corrupt, the only response to power is counter-corruption, and to build her future the way Lucien had built his, efficiently, ruthlessly, on the silence of people who were afraid to speak. She would not do that. She had looked at where that road went. A hand appeared at her elbow. Her father. He stood beside her and looked out at the river and said nothing for a moment, and she let the silence be what it was. The silence of 2 people who have been through something together and have arrived on the other side of it and are standing in the ordinary, ongoing night, which asks nothing from them and offers nothing except its own continuing presence. He would have loved this, Edmund said. He would have said it took too long, Seraphine said. Edmund made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the closest approximation she had heard from him in 2 years. She felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there, small, warm, the particular weight of a thing recovered rather than replaced. She looked at the room one more time. The candles, the faces, the marble floor that she had crossed once in fury and was now crossing in a different direction toward something she did not have a word for yet. Not peace. Peace was too passive for what she felt. Something more active. The forward-facing state of a person who has finished one thing and understands, with the full clarity of someone who has paid for their understanding, that finishing is not the same as completing. That completing takes longer. That completing is what comes after. The slow, unmarked daily work of becoming someone who can walk into the room where their worst things happened and feel, standing in it, that they are larger than what happened to them. She was not there yet. She was on her way. She walked back to the center of the ballroom. She stood on the marble floor where she had once dragged a woman across it, in fury, and felt the specific symmetry of the moment. Same floor, same room, different woman standing on it. Not unchanged, not healed. Changed in the direction of herself, which was the only direction that had ever mattered. The nobles who had whispered about her now watched in silence. She let them watch. Then she turned toward the music that had begun somewhere behind her, someone at the piano, quiet and unhurried. And she let the sound of it fill the room around her, and she stood in the ballroom she had conquered with no weapon except the truth, and she thought about all the things she had lost and all the things she had found in the losing, and she chose, because choosing was the only power that had never been taken from her, to let the night be what it was.